For the introduction, and thank you everyone for being here with us today with the internet outage, and for those online for bearing with us as we figure out the internet situation. I'm really excited to be here today to talk about how we've used geospatial modeling through tangible interfaces and computational notebooks to reach diverse audiences. So if you've been around GIS and geospatial analytics for a while, you might remember using a primary paradigm that we used to interact with geospatial analytics like a decade ago. But now those tools are evolving, and they've evolved to serve diverse audiences through things like web GIS and cloud computing, and we're borrowing practices from data science. And so I want to talk about two of those tools today, in particular, computational notebooks. For geospatial analysis, we'll start with a presentation, some about that. We'll look at a review study of how tangible interfaces can be used for geospatial modeling, and we'll look at two quick case studies. And then at the end, we'll, in the final chapter of this, put it all together, notebooks and tangible interfaces, to support a bigger research project on fecal contamination in surface waters. And so, yeah, let's start with computational notebooks. So many of us might be familiar with them, but they've been around for several decades now. And computational notebooks mix this narrative code, a narrative markdown text, with live code and then the output of that code, all in one document, which makes them really great for exploring your data, sharing your workflow with others, whether that's like the results of an assignment or you want to post it on a website. They are really adaptable for that. And so they support reproducibility and repeatability in the sciences, which is a big topic of interest these days. And so for all these reasons, they're really popular. In particular, the Jupyter Notebook has become a fairly standard tool in data science and in geospatial analytics. And so the beginning of my doctoral time here, I started was a science-backed open source geoprocessing engine. Many of the tools are written by researchers and scientists and have publications associated with them. So it's a really powerful software for doing open science. And if you choose to use any of these, over 400 tools in the core distribution, you have a big selection of interfaces you could choose from. You can use one of the Python APIs, there's an R API, there's a command line interface, there's a C interface, and there's also a graphical user interface, kind of like a traditional desktop GIS software. And so when I first came here, one of the first things I worked on was making Grass easier to use through notebooks, so that we're kind of getting like the best of both worlds, that reproducibility and repeatability and shareableness, and also the power of Grass geocomputation. And so Grass already has a Python API, but there was a need to add some more visualization methods and some environmental management parameters. So these are some of the examples of the package that we ended up writing together, which is detailed in this publication at the bottom, to visualize your data as you're working through the notebook. And so a lot of the work that I'll present here today is documented in these notebooks. So please ask me about them if you'd like to find a notebook that's related to what I'm talking about. And they all look kind of something like this, where you have this workflow explained with text and visuals and the output of the code in line. So the next thing we're going to talk about today is tangible user interfaces for geospatial modeling. And so if you are trying to collaborate on a geospatial problem, you kind of have two options. The first is to use a set of paper maps like this, which is great for face-to-face conversation. Everyone can stand around the map and mark it, put sticky notes on it, but you don't have any simulation or the ability to switch between data layers easily or modify the data. So if you wanted to do that, you'd be stuck gathering around a computer like this. And computers are really meant, though, for just one user. And so you lose some of that face-to-face and that collaborative nature. And so I think that tangible user interfaces are a really cool solution to this problem. Everyone can gather around a shared interface that's tangible and use that to direct the simulation and computation, and it's coupled with a computer so that you have all of the abilities of the computer, but with the face-to-face collaboration of the paper maps. And so we decided to do a literature review on all of these systems. And so if you open up your computer and start looking to find systems that can be used like this, they go by so many different names. First, you might find tangible geospatial modeling system, such as Dr. Tadeusz's dissertation describes. There's a line of literature in urban planning that calls them geospatial tangible user interfaces. You might come across tangible augmented reality. You might find AR sandbox. You might see some people put spatially augmented in front of that, or maybe drop the sandbox, or there's even a line of geography literature that calls them projected augmented relief or landscape models. So all of these, though, can be used to refer to systems that have this geospatial computation coupled with a physical model. And so we decided to come up with our own criteria, and we needed a name for what we were going to call them for systems that meet our criteria. So we settled on geocomputational tangible user interfaces, or G-TUI. And so G-TUIs all have some sort of computation and simulation occurring. Then that's coupled with a sensor that senses the interactions on the table, and a projector that's displaying whatever output happens on the computer, whatever is being simulated. And then all of the visualization and the interaction occurs on the table. And so once we had this definition, we could go through and actually do a systematic review. And so we found 199 publications that met these criteria, describing systems that were describing studies that use G-TUIs, and studies that describe the system, studies that describe the usage of the system, and then some review studies. And for all of these, we also recorded the type of interface, whether it was like sand, clay, or some of them had like pins, actuated pins that you can push and pull up, or objects, the type of sensor used, and then if it had a name or an intended application domain, we recorded that too. And so here's those publications spread over by time. And you can see that the first one was from 1997, the late 90s, that was out of MIT Media Lab. And then there are a trickle of them through the 2000s until sort of 2014 and 2016, when there's a big increase. And then after 2020, they start to trickle off, possibly. I don't know why, but I'd love to hear your ideas for why that happened. I have some hypotheses. And looking across all these systems, we also saw a huge variety of sensors and interfaces. And so this is just like some mock-ups of what they might look like, but imagine being able to pick from any of these and put them on another system. So some, like the tangible landscape system that we have set up in the geovisualization lab, if you want to see it afterwards, use a system like this with a monitor. Some have an actuated terrain, but also with a sensor over it to get gestures of users standing over it. So tons of variety. But there were a couple that stood out, and I want to start with these two older systems. On the bottom, this is that from the late 90s out of MIT called URP, the Urban Planning Workbench. And then above it is a tangible geospatial modeling system. And this scanner up here was pretty common in the G-TUIs that use a depth sensor at that time, but it costs tens of thousands of dollars. So in the early 2000s, like these systems were really expensive and difficult to make. But then with the cheaper sensors and more machine vision algorithms, we saw that explosions of systems sort of in the 2014 to 2016. And now when we look at the whole body of research, 61% of those publications came from one of these four systems or research groups. The first one, tangible landscape, driven by grass and originally developed by Dr. Matashva in our lab group. And then we have AR Sandbox, which you might find at a museum or a university geology department. If you've ever seen the sandboxes where you move your hand over it and water falls underneath. The next one is Cityscope from the MIT Media Lab, and I am including all the publications out of that lab, including URB. And that one's primarily for urban planning. And then the collaborative development platform out of Munich, Germany, also for urban planning. And here are those publications again, but now broken down by domain, since I think it's really interesting to look at how these spread from urban planning and landscape architecture, where like it has its roots with the URB system. And then there's never been a lot of publications, a lot of presence in literature from military logistics and emergency management. And then later we see education and earth and environmental science really entering the scene and becoming like the dominant field that's publishing G-TUI research. And I just want to make some notes about these, since I think it's really interesting to think about where the frontiers are in these fields. In education, with the introduction of AR Sandbox and tangible landscape, there were a ton of studies looking at how if these systems could improve learning outcomes at a variety of ages, studying topographic map principles and spatial reasoning. So at this point, over 1,000 students have been a part of studies looking at that, and the results are pretty mixed. A lot of them report no significant benefit, but I think that there is a benefit to using them for more complex environmental processes, for these spatial processes that are more complex than just topographic map analysis. And there have been some studies about that, and I'll touch on one later in the third chapter. And then the second thing I wanted to note is in earth and environmental science, where a lot of these publications are describing how to couple complex numerical simulations about some earth surface processes with a G-TUI system, but not a lot of them take that next step, which is to bring it into a stakeholder environment or to turn it into a serious game, to take it into a participatory research approach. And so I think that's also a really exciting direction for the field, and one that the center has also kind of dipped its toe into with POPs and things like that. So yeah, okay. So on this note of how it can be used in participatory research, I want to talk about one of my own, a project that I was a part of, looking at historic forts across Belgium and the Netherlands. And so these are 4 forts that are managed in a variety of ways. Some are not open to the public, others are more recreational sites, and they have a large historical significance, but it's difficult to figure out how to make them sustainable, like financially sustainable, to attract visitors and pull them out of the more like over touristed areas. And so this project at Brady University of Applied Scientists was going to brought together a lot of the managers involved with this to have them exchange ideas on how to manage the forts and see what success stories were, what was working at some forts. And they also had collected visitor data. They had study participants wear these skin conductivity sensors that looked at their emotional arousal, not positive or negative emotion, just the amount of emotion that they were feeling, and then walk around the sites. And so you can start to see where participants were feeling more emotional arousal and less emotional arousal. And I was invited to be a part of this to create a tangible landscape activity, a G-TUI activity that could be brought to the workshops with all of the managers and stakeholders to help them explore the data and contextualize it by seeing what people could see as they were walking around the fort. So in this example, where this pin is, everywhere that's highlighted in green is somewhere that someone standing here could see. And what it would look like if they were to make some sort of modification, like a lookout tower or a new bridge, and what the impact of that new feature would be on the what was visible to a visitor. And so here's a picture after the workshop, and you can see here's all those forts from the first slide that are now turned into little sand landscapes. And we created them with these 3D printed molds. And we felt it was a really successful way, not just to engage them in the results of the study, but also to facilitate that discussion about what might the next steps be, and how, like, exchange ideas about what the fort's future might look like. And this is a quote from the local paper that was covering the workshop. And one participant felt that they learned that if they installed a lookout point, that might help attract more visitors and enhance their experience. And we have a publication under review that talks a little bit about it, and there's also some media coverage. Okay, the next example I want to talk about is close to home for a lot of us in this room. When in the GIS 714, teaching geocomputation and geosimulation, one of the units has these learning objectives of learning some collaborative software development with Git and GitHub, writing executable Python scripts, and reinforcing some of the other units, the geospatial computation and simulation processes that we learn in other units. And so as a way to teach these, students create their own tangible landscape activity. And so I've done this, and if you also have done this, you are one of 47 students who've successfully created a tangible landscape activity. And so I think it's a really creative use of a G-TUI for teaching things that aren't just topographic map reasoning and like spatial reasoning, right? It's a novel way of using it. And if we look across all 47, if you submitted one, I looked at yours and I classified it into one of these categories. And most of them were doing like fairly basic hydrology, topographic analysis, ponding, overland flow accumulation, slope, aspect. But some were really novel and interesting, like pollinator connectivity, looking at Gwen. There was one Luke Allen did about an atmospheric pressure wave moving across the topography. So after reading all these studies and seeing the case studies, you might be wondering, why aren't G-TUIs everywhere? Like, they seem very cool, right? Well, I think that there's a couple things that make it really challenging for everyone to have one. And I think the first one is the long-term maintenance of the software. We've been looking at these through like publications, right? And those are often grant funded, but as with any software, there's a need to maintain the software, to update it as packages deprecate. And so that's a real challenge, is that once those projects are done, the systems created, they often, are not maintained through time. And relatedly is the discontinuation of hardware and software and it not being accessible like throughout the globe. So the Xbox Connect, which I think is responsible for that huge flux of systems in the 2014 to 2016, that's now been discontinued. And there are replacement sensors for it, but then you're back to your software issue, where now you need to modify the software to work with that new sensor, something Everett is very familiar with. And then I also think data physicalization is getting easier, but it's still challenging. Anytime you want to change what the terrain you're working on, you have to reprint or create a new mold or figure out how to, to collect the materials and create them. And that's a big investment of time and money. But there are a couple opportunities I'm excited to see where it goes. One of my hypotheses of why the publications rate went down after 2020 is that I excluded publications that were using AR goggles as the primary visualization technique, because I was interested in systems where we're all seeing the same thing at the same time in like a very physical shared sense, and AR glasses mean that just you are seeing. But I saw a lot of publications that are using AR glasses, so I'm really curious if that's the direction this field will go in and if we'll see a lot more of those. And then the second one, this is a figure from describing the POP system. I am really intrigued by the remote user options that are available when you start to use server-based configurations. So if you are interacting with the sandbox and you place a felt patch on it, that's sent to a server, which then shares it with a remote participant who can see it, draw their own felt patch, and that comes back on, displayed back on the sandbox, enabling that multiple end user and multiple interface. I think that's a really cool direction and one that's very, very novel. Okay, so now we'll put it all together and look at how notebooks and tangible interfaces support an ongoing research project looking at fecal contamination in surface waters in eastern North Carolina. And so Eastern North Carolina is like an agricultural powerhouse. It is it's the third highest swine producing area in the nation, surpassed only by Iowa and Minnesota. So we're also like top 5 for poultry production. And we also make a lot of corn and soy and sweet potatoes. And there's also, like, complicating all that, a lot of people that live out there on septic systems that might be contributing even more fecal waste. And so, yeah, we also land apply a lot of fertilizer. This is a video I got to take with Emma, where they're spraying swine waste on the landscape as fertilizer, and this is chicken litter being sprayed or spread on a field, which is a great use of the waste to recycle those nutrients, but it also can have harmful effects on the environment. And so if we look at where a lot of this farming is occurring across the state, this is a map of this confined swine animal feed operations, and you can see they're really clustered in these 5 counties in eastern North Carolina. So this study went out and sampled 49 sites. Emma and others went out and sampled 49 sites. Each one they sampled 4 times seasonally throughout the course of a year, looking for fecal contamination. And where they found fecal indicator bacteria, they also ran additional tests, to see if they could find the DNA that waste originated from, which could tell us a bit about the sources of that fecal waste, whether it's coming from swine or cattle or humans. And so that adds another piece of information to this puzzle of figuring out why the waters are contaminated. And so for some watershed context, this is the Neuse River watershed, and this is the Cape Fear watershed. Raleigh and Durham are up here, the Research Triangle. And all the points were in the Neuse or the Northeast Cape Fear or the Black River over here. You can zoom in a little bit. And so one of my contributions to the project was to create reproducible methods for characterizing the environment upstream of each of these sample sites. And so for all of these attributes, I created a series of notebooks so that other people could reproduce this, and as they gather more sample sites, they could run the analyses over again and get the same environmental contextual data, and that might help in the interpretation and understanding of their sampling results. So for example, figuring out what's upstream of each sample site. I'm not going to go through each of these. I'm going to give us the highlights, the most interesting pieces, I think. So if we look at what's upstream of each site, to do that was workflow again in Grass and Jupyter. And I started with a 10-meter digital elevation model. And Emma collected GPS points at each sample site. And so from the flow accumulation, I derived streams and then snapped each of her GPS points to the streams. And for most sites, that was effective. But for some, the GPS point was a little far off, and I would have to go in and manually bring the point closer and make sure that the description of the point matched where the point was snapped to. We also looked at land cover via NLCD, the National Land Cover Data Set, and you can see that this is a pretty heavily agricultural area, with some areas having more than 60% of the land used as cultivated crop. And so the lighter points have more crop, and the darker, more green points have less cropland. And then they're also sized by area. So the biggest one is the Neuse River here with an upstream area of over 6,000 kilometers squared. And then some of them are quite small, like only 3 kilometers squared. And 60% seems like a lot of land, but if we look at the NLCD data, if we put the cropland over that, you can see that it is really so dominated by cropland. There's a lot of food being grown out there and crops. Okay, so these are the sampling results broken down by species. And I think what's interesting about this is that a lot of them didn't test positive. Some had just one positive test or tested positive for one species, and others, like this one, had all of the different species they tested for present at one time or another. But most of these sites only tested positive once, maybe twice. So it's super temporally variable. And when I first saw this, I thought, surely we could look at one site, say this one, which tested positive for swine, zoom in on it and figure out exactly where, who was responsible for this fecal contamination. And so I thought, okay, there's, four farms upstream of it. Maybe they're spraying the waste on the field next to it, and then we'll use topographic, we'll look at the topography and see how it's routing the waste to the exit to the sample site. But I think the reality is way more complicated than that. There are a lot of different pathways that fecal waste could have reached the waterway. There are feral swine in the area. It only tested positive once out of the 4 times it was sampled. There's also lots of other livestock activity that could have resulted in fecal waste washing into the watershed. And there's subsurface like drainage tiles that could be transporting it from outside of the watershed. And so just to highlight how variable it is, we can look at this site, which didn't test positive for any species, but on the very same day that it tested to have no detectable levels of DNA, upstream of it tested positive for swine, but there are no animal feed operations upstream of it. So I think, to me, what I learned when I was doing this analysis is that it's a really difficult, tracing the sources of this fecal contamination is a really difficult problem. For another example, like a lot of these tested positive for human DNA. And so if we look at one of those sites, this one tested positive for human, swine, and bovine. And so I have the animal feed operations in red. And then we developed a workflow to look for buildings that were in 100 meters of the stream. And we could also filter them by when they were built so that we can look for buildings that might be at risk for having failing septics. And we can find areas like this, where there's like a cluster of buildings that might have septic systems that are near the waterway. And so perhaps that could be an area for future research, or it could steer some of the stakeholder engagement in the future. The second part of the study that I contributed to was connecting the results with stakeholders. So as we were getting all these results in and looking at the landscape around them, we're seeing all these opportunities for like wetland enhancement and stream buffers and places where we might be able to capture some of the fecal waste that might be flowing into the watershed. So we decided to do that by building G-TUI activity. And so this is the SIMWI overland flow model, which is implemented in grass. And so these particles maybe represent some fecal waste that's been land applied, and they're moving through the topography to the waterways. And this model is sensitive to land cover, so we can adjust the infiltration and the speed that the particles move over the landscape by adjusting, like we can have it be spatially variable, reflecting the land cover. So we can model things like vegetated buffers and changes in land cover and land use. So we were able to turn that model into this, which is an activity that I built in collaboration with the College of Education. And it's kind of a game. You can select what area you want to apply your fertilizer. Then you can build little modifications to the topography using your sand budget that might represent some actual amount of, might be a proxy for the amount of money you have to spend on the project. And then you can also plant vegetation with these patches, and where the particles hit the patches, they'll slow down, and some of them will infiltrate into the soil and be removed from the simulation. And then the patches are sensed, and you run the simulation by hitting the red button, and you can see that by the interventions that this user has put on has resulted in 11% more of the particles being kept on the property and not flowing into the waterways. So these yellow outlined areas are the waterways, and the goal of the activity is to minimize the number of particles that reach the waterway. And so we were able to bring this to some stakeholders. Here we are in Sampson County and in the city of Clinton. And this was a really cool experience for me because these are folks that think about this all the time. And they had some really interesting feedback and ideas and, different nature-based solutions they would want to see. And we used it as a discussion point after we presented a lot of the sampling results. And it also had some broader impacts. For example, we have 2 publications that talk about it. It won the AGU Student Visualization Competition in 2024. And it was also part of a study at the College of Education. And this is a callback to what I was talking about earlier with how these systems can be effective for teaching more complicated environmental processes. In a dissertation from Amber Meeks at the College of Education, she found that this system improved learning outcomes for middle school students who were learning about phosphate runoff and phosphate sustainability. And their learning outcomes were significantly improved over a comparable paper-based activity. And she had a sample size of almost 100 students, I think. So that just goes to show that although it might not be effective for teaching spatial reasoning and topographic map things, I think it shows a lot of promise for more complex geospatial processes. And while we're talking about the broader impacts of this work, I have to say that the integration of grass and Jupyter I mentioned at the beginning was one of the coolest things that I think I got to be a part of during my time here. Although it wasn't a lot of my time, it is now part of the grass core distribution. So if you download grass onto your machine, you will have this integration. And it's worked synergistically with all these other improvements to grass that have been happening recently, like the new tools API. Now there's an effort to get the notebooks integrated into the graphical user interface. And I also got to observe other Google Summer of Code students build on my work, which, it feels very special to have someone else use your code and improve it and make it better. And I got to see it used in other classes and workshops and tutorials and was welcomed into the grass community over my time here. So very grateful for that experience. And it also led to some opportunities that I probably wouldn't have gotten otherwise, such as going to conferences around the world to teach workshops and clinics. Here's Prati and I teaching a workshop on tangible landscape, but we're teaching it using the grass and Jupyter integration. And we also converted the 714 assignments into notebooks. And we got a Delta grant to digital education grant to explore implementing it in a master's level course. And so thank you. I couldn't have done all this work without my wonderful lab mates who supported me along the way. And of course, all my collaborators in the grass community who have been with me every step of the way. And you can't go to conferences around the world without having really good administrative support. And I'm so grateful to Lois and Rachel for that. And of course, my friends that I've met along the way, and my family and partner, Pat, for bearing with me as I finish this work. And that's all I have. I'd love to take some.
Caitlin, for engaging presentation, and now I'm opening the floor for the question. Feel free to ask.
Yes, yeah. I was just simply curious, like, so how did it look like the GIS 714 class before the Jupyter Notebook iteration?
That's a great question. I'm almost ready to pull up the website, but I'm going to refrain. And that will be difficult for me. But they were documented as command line, like a command line tutorial on the website. So it would have the same descriptive text with a command line argument that you would copy and then paste into the console of Grass. And so they had the exact same workflow. It's just that you would copy and paste from the website. Yeah. Yeah.
First, great job. Really interesting to see how you took Grass and was able to share it with a lot of different stakeholders, whether like at NC State and external. So that's where my question's coming in. Like with the variety of stakeholders who you interface with, could you just give us like a highlights list of some of those? And then maybe also go into, did you see similarities between them, like when you explained the tool, how they used it? Did you notice any like age group or like, yeah. So
Yeah.
along that vein.
Yeah, that's a great one, especially considering like this is the same activity but used in such different contexts. And I think this was a really interesting one because the activity was designed with the College of Education kind of for that middle school audience in mind at first, and I think that led a lot of the like gamification of it and the decision to make it particle based, and so I think that made it really engaging for students, although many of them were building like volcanoes, and it didn't take them that long to figure out that because it was such a short overland flow simulation that you could get 100% if you put your field surrounded by moats, like you just completely enclose your land, it actually will give you a high score. And then with the government employees, they were like really like, so what model is doing this? So how much of the nutrients would get taken out? Like I think if I were to redo this activity for them, would want to make it much more quantitative, thinking about the actual movement of water instead of like visualizing the dynamics of the particles leaving the surface. But they were really interested in using it on specific properties. And when they interact with it, they tended to do really, really realistic interventions. Like there was no moat building. It was like, what if we mandated stream buffers, things like that. So yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Could you talk about some of the challenges in either bringing the technology or just people having any type of friction engaging?
Yeah. Across all user groups. I think when you're there as a facilitator and you say, okay, now you can go ahead and play with my sandbox. Like getting that first person to start playing with it is really challenging. And I think the most effective way we ever figured out was actually in the middle schoolers. We would invite them all like, okay, we're just gonna run the simulation, like everyone like put their hands on it and make one change or something. And before that, we also had them, we played a game with the sand where you had to make a picture of something in the sand and then everyone would try and guess what it was. Like just to get over that initial friction of playing with the sand and getting your hands on it, I think is really difficult. And having those like icebreaker activities was really helpful in that context. And figuring out how to do it with like the government employees and some of the other places I've been. I like have definitely been playing with how to break the ice and get people get people playing with it. I think that's
Maybe because
big.
they feel that they're gonna break it, that they're going to damage something.
Yeah, I think I think it's like not the peer pressure of not wanting to be the first one. And then not being sure like if there's a right answer, you know? Like it truly is an exploratory tool. There's no wrong answer. But I think when you stand there, you're just kind of like, okay, now you're waiting for me to do something with it, you know, like that initial hesitation. Maybe we've all felt it. It's really, yeah. I don't know if that, yeah.
Good.
Nice presentation, thanks. I'm curious about the surface water contamination study. So you said you tested the water quarterly. I'm wondering if you took into consideration any other covariates like rainfall, because I know some work is showing
Yeah,
that rainfall matters for people contamination.
I'm so glad you asked. I did. So one of the things that I have a notebook for is looking at precipitation preceding the sampling event. So I found the closest climate office rain station to each of the upstream areas. And then I aggregated that for all the sites. But then the other thing I did was look at whether there was precipitation or there was not, and whether there was DNA found and if there was not. And I found a significant relationship between the two. So you're more likely to find DNA in the waterway if there's been rain before the sampling. But again, that's in like a fairly 49 sites tested quarterly. So that's your sample size.
How long before?
I did 72 hours. Yeah. Yeah.
So going back to like the Ford study where they like measured like the way like users felt as they walked around landscape, have you seen ways where like users' experience with a graphical interface such as this could be measured like when applying a buffer or different features?
Yeah, like so if you could have people using a G-TUI while wearing emotional arousal data. Oh, that's a good question. I think I found a study that did that on kids and it was looking at their like emotional state while they're playing with it. And then I also found a system, and this one is really cool and kind of crazy that it had like simulated weather on the terrain, and that weather was affected by your heart rate and and your so they had some sort of like skin electrode. So I think that is definitely a frontier. I would have to look and see what has been done, but I know that there's at least that one that was like your state influenced the weather on the train, and then there was one looking at in children how they were the emotions they were experiencing as they played with it. Yeah.
So for your surface water acquisition study, you specifically look into surface water. But one thing came to my mind is for that specific study, it should be groundwater also can be significant. So
Yeah.
have you thought about also including groundwater for your analysis?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I know that groundwater is a dominant transport mechanism in Eastern North Carolina. And this study was looking at waterways. And so those waterways contain water that's been transported through the environment. And I think this is something I've thought a lot about because DNA breaks down in the environment. So you would need a fairly short time span between the fecal waste, you know, leaving its origin and reaching the sample site. So the best we can figure from some of the time we had one like shorter or a couple time series sampling events that happened along the waterways. We think that if there's a fecal waste like getting spread right next to one of those unbuffered drainages, if it's transported through the water, through the surface to the unbuffered drainage in a relatively short time span, then is carried through the surface water. That could be how we're getting the DNA to the sample site. But I think that there is a lot that if I were to be like suggesting the follow-up SAM. I would be really curious how what's leaching into the waterways and whether there's empty DNA in that or the DNA in that. And then I'm also curious about whether the runoff from the fields, how degraded the DNA is at that state. Like if they're spraying it from those, like how much DNA is really in that spray. So that's a great, yeah. People in this study we should all be talking about that. Yeah, yeah,
Do we have any more questions?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, back to your first study, the systematic review of G-TUIs.
Yes.
I'm curious of your decision to not include the augmented reality goggles. Was that based on our knowledge that they prevent that collaboration, or that was you assuming that the use of goggles will prevent a bit more of a more interactive, collaborative environment because we're not all looking at the same thing and you don't have that intertwined connection.
Yeah. Yes to both of them. I think I have this hypothesis that they decrease that human like face to face, but I think that they also, we had to put boundaries on what we wanted to study. And there are so many systems that get into this like augmented, does it have to have a physical terrain or is it all in the augmented reality goggles? Would we include tablet-based visualizations? Would we, so just for one, because I think that this is like the best way to get that face-to-face collaboration. And then two, to put like bounds on what we were going to review in the study. That's why I chose to exclude them. Yeah.
Okay, I think we are through with the questions.